Commissioner Robert Bender. Commissioner Bender, thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Travis. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. It's great to see this many come out to have the input for this project. Just looking out front when everybody was walking in to see the excitement that you all show when you're telling stories about the creek growing up, or the bayou, and even what we're seeing in this area and how it's improved the last few years is great. I know my father-in-law talks about having mud fights in Bayou Texar, and they're glad they didn't end up with a third eyeball or anything. So, and of course, what we're doing today and in the future with this project is to improve the quality of the bayou, improve the quality of the creek, to allow access for the community to enjoy that for many generations, so that we can enjoy it and have fun and not have any worries about what we're doing. Of course, I would like to recognize a few of the other public officials that are here today, and of course, without their support previously and in the future, we wouldn't be able to get this done. Namely, Mayor Robinson, who was the county commissioner before me, made sure that this project got on the restore list, and has been a big part of the efforts to improve Carpenter Creek. Council member Sherry Byers, again, she's been very active. I'm sure most of you, if you know anything about the creek, then you've associated that with Ms. Myers. And I want to thank both of them for all of their work. Council member Jared is here also, and of course there he is. He gets I think both sides of the bayou, and of course is doing a great job in his first term as council member. And then also ECUA Representative Dale Perkins. And then of course, as I mentioned, Sherry has done a lot of work. Lori Murphy couldn't be here tonight with Emerald Coast Keeper. I've done a couple of the cleanups, as have most of the other elected officials that are here, and Sherry's probably at every one of them. But I would also like to say that they are having another cleanup this weekend. Meet behind the Mellow Mushroom at 9 a.m. on Saturday, if anybody would like to make it. The weather doesn't look like it'll be too cold. It won't be snowing and freezing like it was when we did one 2 years ago. But a great way to get in and see the creek, improve the quality of it, and just have an impact on it. Of course, some of the things that the county's doing, actually tomorrow, we're approving, hopefully approving, the final contract for a purchase of land just north of I-10 on the creek. It's off of Winnedy Drive. It's a little over, I think, 5.4 acres that we're going to acquire, and this is, again, an opportunity for us to preserve the land along the creek and add to the accessibility and things that we can do with this project by acquiring this land. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to continue to improve the creek, and I look forward to moving that forward tomorrow. And then the other thing is that we've just been approved for a NERDA grant. This is leveraging some of these restore funds. Like Grover says, we need to leverage what we get from the restore to get other funds. And we've already done that by getting $2 million from the NERDA grant. So again, something we're very excited about, that will help improve the quality of the creek and the bayou. I would like to introduce some of the Escambia County staff that are helping with this project. We have Matt Posner, who's the Restore Program Manager. He's up front right here. Terry Berry is way in the back, and she's the Environmental Project Coordinator. And then Brent Whip, Water Quality and Land Management Manager. Brent's, he's in the center in the back there. So again, I'm very happy that we have this Escambia County staff working on the project and the job that they do every day. We do have a little timeline of how this project has come to be. Of course, we are coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The the impact that that has had, of course, has been felt large and wide throughout the Gulf of Mexico. But we're able to, from that tragedy, we were able to use the settlement that that was reached in 2016 to have projects like this. And the Restore Pot is only a small part of the settlement that BP reached with the Gulf states in doing this, and with the tragedy of the oil spill. And so again, this is only a small part of that. We also have the Triumph funds and others that we have access to, but of course, without that tragedy, we wouldn't be able to have the impact and access to funds to improve our community like we're doing today. And of course, it's great that we're starting this. Of course, we would have liked to have had it done 10 years, or not wait 10 years, but that it is, as it is getting done around the 10-year anniversary. It's a reminder both why we're doing it and what we want to prevent from happening in the future. And then with this slide, I'd like to turn it over to Chrissy with Wood. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Travis, is this move? Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so I'm Chrissy Maley. I'm the project manager for Wood, who's the lead engineering firm for the watershed management plan. So what is a watershed? By show of hands, who knows what a watershed is? Okay, good. So we have some educated audience, that's great. So for those of you who aren't quite sure what a watershed is, you've heard the term, but you're not exactly sure, it's a geographic area that drains to a specific body of water. So kind of like a bowl. If I were to, spill some water outside, or it were to rain, where would that water go? So sometimes it takes a short, quick path into the creek or the bayou. Sometimes it takes a long, windy path. It might go down your road, drain into a ditch, maybe go into a pond. It might sit in that pond for a while, and then maybe it outfalls, eventually out to the creek. So every little bit of land where the water falls and eventually gets into Carpenter Creek or Bayou Texar is part of our watershed. So what is a watershed management plan? Well, it's a plan to evaluate the current health of the watershed, look at how it was historically, and then to make some recommendations to see if we can't restore the natural function and health of the watershed and make it a more resilient water body and a more resilient community. Looks like we missed a couple slides maybe with the team, so I'll just introduce our team. Oh, it's right after today's workshop? Okay, sorry about that. So today we want to discuss the watershed management plan. We want to talk about the process that we're going to go through. We want to gather expert knowledge and information for further analysis. We're really excited that so many of you were able to attend today. Without the community, this plan is not going to be successful. So thank you all for coming out. Our goal today is to listen to you all, listen to what you would like to see in the watershed, what you're currently seeing in the watershed, and so we can implement that information. And then we also are going to share some of our insights on the preliminary assessments that we've already completed. So as I said, I'm Chrissy Maley, I'm the project manager for Wood. Stand up when I call your name. Jeanette Kelson, she's our assistant project manager and our senior engineer. John Kiefer, he's our biophysical engineer and technical advisor. He leads our stream team. And Mary Safranik is our water quality technical lead. Part of our Escape is one of our team members, and with us today is Gina Worth, principal in charge. Lee Altman is our project manager, and Mike Byros, who's the lead designer, way in the back. We're also very excited to have Keith Johnson with Wetland Sciences, a local environmental scientist, and Impact Campaign with Travis Peterson and Brooke Fleming. Let's go out there. So, like I said, we're all very excited to be working with the county and the community on this project. And I think Commissioner and Travis mentioned a couple things, but there are a lot of video cameras, so please note that if you just be aware that you might be on video, you might be in some of the, somebody's picture, so hopefully you're all okay with that. If not, please let somebody know as soon as possible. And also, we're not really set up to do a formal Q&A session. We want to be respectful of everybody's time, but we do have, as you can see, a large number of team members here. So we'll be gathering a little bit later in the hallway with some smaller groups, and we'll be more than happy to take all of those questions at that time. So while we're not set up to do it here, we are set up to answer questions later. With that, I'll hand it over to Gina. Oh, I'm so sorry. I almost forgot to acknowledge some of the most important members of our community who have really driven the project to this point. So I'd like to acknowledge the Emerald Coast Keepers, University of West Florida, the Brown Fishermen's Association, Panhandle Watershed Alliance, just to name a few. There's also many other local advocates, activists, and public officials who have been really engaged in this process and really have, had such a care and love for the creek and the bayou that has driven this project to this point. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chrissy. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening to talk about this important topic, the Carpenter Creek and Bayou Texar Watershed. So I think the work that we're presenting this evening is really very much in draft form. It's for feedback, it's for engagement, it's to make sure we're looking at the right things, it's to identify kind of gaps in the information. We're really here to listen to this wider community, to learn more about the watershed, your lived experience in the watershed, and to hear a little bit about what you see as potential futures for Carpenter Creek Watershed. So we're going to present some slides and some thoughts, but I think really this is all kind of early draft and really want to use this group as a sounding board for this project as it evolves. That's really the goal this evening. So we've collected some major goals of the project, of the Watershed Management Plan. One of the first kind of primary goals is really to manage water quantity and improve water quality within the entire watershed. Make sure it is healthy from an ecological perspective. A second goal is to protect, enhance, and restore wildlife habitat within the creek and within the bayou and within its larger watershed surroundings. So we may be talking about parcels that are not purely on the water or adjacent to the water. We're also talking about those parcels that are upstream in the headlands and offset from the water bodies, but still part of that larger, greater watershed area that we're discussing. Another primary goal is to expand public access and recreation opportunities. It's been very interesting throughout the day. We've been meeting with different stakeholder groups, and we've been kind of filling in the physical model that we have outside with different people's perceptions along the watershed. We invite all of you to participate in that activity after this meeting. And what we've really noticed is that all the little tags that people have identified as great places to be or unsafe places to be or just impressions of different places, they're all, they kind of fill Bayou Texar because it's very open, it's very visible, people live along it, there's public parcels there. But around the 9th and the 12th Street Bridge, those little tags stop. The upper reaches of the watershed are very difficult to see. You don't even know when you're driving over them. You may not know if you're parking in a Target parking lot. You might be right next to Carpenter Creek, but have no idea. That whole half of the watershed in many ways is very inaccessible. And so a big effort around this project is to expand public access to these resources and identify new recreation opportunities that can be invested in and planned in for the future that really unlock that whole system to this wider community. Another goal is to build more equitable and resilient communities because all of you and all the people that live within the watershed are part of that human and ecological system. And I think critical to that piece is to foster stewardship by connecting residents to their watershed. How can we use this project to really make the greater, broader community, both residential landowners, property owners for commercial properties, aware that their actions, their land use practices, the way that we manage our properties impacts the health of the watershed itself. And so this is something I think that's a really important conversation. How can we build a stronger friends group around these water bodies? And so those are the kind of larger aspirational goals of this project, and we'd love to hear from all of you this evening, like, are we on target with those goals? Are there other things that we should be thinking about in relationship to this project? We're also working on an expanded timeline for this effort. So there's a significant amount of data collection, of research, of monitoring and modeling that will happen throughout the lifetime of the watershed plan, particularly led by Wood, our technical experts. And so that's going to take some time. So we wanted to make sure that we were transparent here about the schedule and kind of sharing the different ways that you can continue to stay engaged in this effort and influence the plan at these critical moments. So let's see. There you go. You can see my mouse. So we are here today, right at the very beginning of this process. The team is working on a desktop watershed evaluation, and we're also beginning our community engagement with this meeting. In September of this year, we'll be having our second meeting, and you can see that meeting occurs kind of right at the nexus between the end of the desktop watershed evaluation and the larger scale watershed assessment, which is going to involve more field studies and modeling and larger scale technical investigations. After that work, at the end of that period, we begin the watershed planning phase, which is really about recommendations, developing these recommendations based upon this over a year-long period of rigorous study, a rigorous technical study. We'll be also identifying projects, like key projects to move forward that could kind of catalyze this plan. Identifying the regulatory opportunities and hurdles that these plans may face, and also setting up monitoring and evaluation benchmarks to really judge how can we understand in the future if this plan is working, right? What are we judging it against? And so I think a really critical meeting will be this third meeting. So the second meeting will be about sharing data, and the third meeting in December of 2021 will really be about this community, and hopefully you and all of your friends coming here to evaluate those recommendations and those plans and those potential sites and tell us, like, are we looking at the right thing? Should we be prioritizing something else? Like, we're going to have a feedback session around that. So nothing will be finalized until it's been shared with the wider community. And then there is a final meeting, meeting number 4, which is really in that kind of final period of finalizing the plan, wrapping things up, sharing it once more with this group for feedback and review, and making sure there's a really engaged community process around this. You're probably thinking, like, whoa, this is a long time, right? This is not a quick, fast, like, just jam it out project. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of investigation, there's a lot of study that really needs to be done on this watershed. It's a huge area, and there's a lot of unknowns, so we have a really kind of incredible team, I think, focused on making sure that we are getting the right data inputs and evaluating the right things. A lot of different stakeholders to work with. We've already been working in the watershed doing this. And so one of the tools that we've also developed as a team to make sure there are different ways to stay engaged in the effort is that we have a project website, which is restorethewatershed.com. And we'll also have a project newsletter. So we really hope all of you sign up for the newsletter. I think if you have signed up via eBrite or the e-invitation for this meeting, you'll be signed up for the newsletter. So we hope you enjoy that. But that will provide some, I think, monthly or bi-monthly updates on the status of the project itself. And so we really encourage you to kind of share this with the wider community. We have a one-pager, which I hope all of you grabbed as you walked in the door today, that has the website web address. Feel free to grab a couple if you want to drop them off at your church, if you want to drop them off at your community association, or give one to a neighbor. We really are hoping that this group can help spread the word about this project and get more people engaged in this effort. So we also wanted to share just a little bit of our kind of very early level analysis on the history of the Carpenter Creek and Bayou Texar water systems. We know they play a really critical role in the formation of Pensacola and Escambia County. And we also want to make sure that we're getting the story right. So again, we're sharing this kind of in the spirit of, like, understanding, are we telling the right narrative? Is this what this creek means to this community? Is this how the bayou is used? We want to, like, learn from you after this meeting, like, are we hitting the right points here? We've tried to really look really far back at kind of Pensacola culture, identify different groups of indigenous peoples that use this landscape, particularly these coastal interfaces. Historical record shows that These communities really relied upon the bounty of the oceans and the bays, like adjacent Mobile Bay. And you can see evidence of this in shell middens and pottery fragments that are found within the watershed itself. So there is still kind of archaeological evidence of the long period of cultural use of this watershed space. So that's something that's like pretty fascinating and interesting. It's also the site, kind of close out to the bay of the Luna settlement, where there are also archaeological fragments like this anchor still able to be kind of found and displayed. And we see here the beginning of Bayou Texar, kind of in this early map from 1822 of the development of Pensacola. It's kind of the two different directions of the street grid and the mouth of Bayou Texar up in the right corner there on this map, kind of helping frame and contain the edge of the city over time. So we had to kind of expand the map, so that same corner that we were just looking at has now moved here. You can see this is really the edge of the city of Pensacola. This map shows the watershed in 1921. So if you were looking at the maps on the wall, or you were looking at the model outside, this watershed area is in this black dotted line here. It's probably a little difficult to see on the screen, but we can also talk to it outside. But what you can see in that 1921, there was the historic downtown Pensacola urban grid, very well developed, but much of the greater watershed area was forested. There's large patches of remnant forest that are visible in this drawing. There's some agricultural lands. There's railroads and roads beginning to cross this landscape, but a lot of the urbanization is concentrated here and not really in the greater watershed area. We've also kind of looked through the archives, and members of our team have begun to identify these different old images, some that we know the dates, some we don't. There's historic industry along Carpenter Creek, as in the sawmill here in 1925, still an active site of industry. But the bayou itself was an active site of recreation, as you can see from these group swimmers enjoying the water. I think we're really lucky tonight to be joined by many members of the community that remember the different ways the creek's been used in the past. And so it's really exciting to see this quote from Sherry Myers here about this famous swimming hole. That was Aunt Jenny's hole that had these different communities kind of sharing this watery space and using it kind of as a public ground for swimming together, for recreating along the waterfront. And I think it's a very important point that the councilwoman makes, that this is a really important place to the history of Pensacola, and we need to tell and expand that history. So we can see some of those moments of public gathering in these archival images. Even as early as 1880, there was a boathouse on Bayou Texar, and then the bayou itself, like at Bayview, was used as a place for large-scale gatherings and events like Independence Day, 4th of July, on the water. So over time, we begin to see a little bit of that urbanization from this downtown core begin to creep up into the watershed area. So you see more development along the roads and along the railroads, so more industrial development near the railroads, more residential and commercial development on many of the highways and secondary roads that exist within the area. In this time period, we also have the development of the new airport site, which today is a large land use within the watershed itself. And you still see the kind of the image of the creek with a much larger series of forest patches around it existing within this mosaic in the 40s and 50s. There's also these great kind of experiences of passive recreation, which are also still evident and still happen today along the bayou and in some places along the creek. Places simply to kind of linger and look at the water, enjoy the shade, maybe go fishing. Also more active recreation, have a much more kind of intense experience with the water, maybe take a perilous dive off a 30-foot diving platform, but different ways that different communities are really using the water body as an active resource. This is also the era in which we see larger scale infrastructure being constructed around the watershed. So the construction of the Bayou Texar Bridge in 1955 is shown in these images. And while that really enabled a lot of movement around the watershed for people, it sometimes constricted or impacted movement of water in these areas. So all the bridges that cross the creek and the bayou, in some ways have modified the way that the system operates. We then enter a larger area of urban growth and suburban sprawl. So in the 70s and 80s, we really see a much larger scale expansion of urban land use in the watershed. We see more development of schools, more development of interstate highways. So some of the larger interchanges really begin to appear on the map. They're improved, they're expanded. Sites like the Sacred Heart Hospital begin to be developed very close to the creek, so great opportunities there, also potential impacts there. And you really, just in general, see a lot more urbanization happening in this footprint of the watershed area. And this has triggered physiological changes to the creek itself, right? The creek doesn't exist in isolation to its greater watershed. So if the watershed land use changes, if you end up having more impervious surface, water is flowing off those surfaces much faster, going into the creek systems much faster, you end up getting what's called like a peaked hydrograph, or you have a lot of water happening, like moving through the system very, very quickly all at once, where historically forests and grasslands and meadows kind of damped down the accelerated pressure of that water and stored it and percolated it. So that actually changes the actual kind of physical structure of the creek and the creek bottoms itself. And so we have some really interesting quotes, like from the Brim Fishermen's Association newsletter, about how the creek used to be crystal clear with a gravel bottom, how it had runs and riffles and pools and glides, and that some of the pools were very, very deep, with narrow banks, such that a grown man could stand in the creek and touch both banks from the center. This is very different, I think, than the creek that we see today, and so some of these kind of changes of before and after, and just changes over time, I think are really interesting for this project to understand. So to continue that quote, today the creek is less than 2 feet deep, and sands have smothered the gravel bars, leaving a wide and scoured system, and that many of the remaining native species have been displaced by invasive non-native species. So this is something that we saw a little bit of in our watershed walk that Lee is going to walk us through in a moment. But I think it's just a really important reminder that the creek has been modified. It's been modified physically by people, changing the actual banks of the creek, hardening, straightening the creek, but it's also been changed by the wider land use practices in the watershed itself. And so we're just seeing some of these elements, like the hardened banks and box culvert on Carpenter Creek, even in the 70s. Conditions today are different, but also, again, still modified, highly modified by people. Moments of stream bank hardening, and then this large amount of sedimentation that you begin to see in the creek in this era, and you definitely see today. A lot of this comes from large-scale erosion that's happening along the channel edges because of that accelerated water movement after rain events. We also know that the bayou itself has been modified. It kind of, if you didn't know, you would look at it and be like, oh, what a pristine landscape, but the landscape is dredged, particularly to help improve like flushing throughout the system for ecological and recreational benefits. This is an image of removing the sandbar near Bayview Park. And so this whole watershed, the whole water bodies and the land uses around them have been touched by the human hand in some way, impacted by the human hand. And so this is the system that we have today. This is a land use map that's coded with typical land use colors. So in yellow here is residential. And so you can see that the residential footprint, little homes, some multifamily, some single family, in these areas, it's one of the predominant land uses in the watershed is residential development. So if you live in the watershed, you have potential to impact the quality of the watershed. So I think that's actually a really exciting thing. It's not a negative thing. There's a lot of people here that could and do care about this creek system. We also see a lot of commercial development here in red. So if you've been to Cordova Mall, you have been in the watershed, and water that runs off those parking lots moves into the creek system, right? So these are all very important things to think about maybe when we're doing our holiday shopping, right? Like tying it back to our everyday lives. The purple colors are both institutional and industrial land use. So this is the industrial land use, this is the institutional color. The little green color represents natural and recreational features along the creek and some other park spaces within the community. And then the gray and the dark gray are both travel, like transportation space and utility space within the watershed. So you can see that the airport here has a really large land use footprint within the watershed today. Looking at it through a different lens of soils and hydrologic groups, this kind of tan color here, this group A, is the predominant soil type in the watershed, and maybe surprise, surprise, it's very sandy, like much of the area around Pensacola. Some of the creek beds have a little bit more clay and a little bit less permeable, but for a great portion of the watershed, the soils are incredibly sandy, incredibly porous, and so water that runs off these spaces often percolates before it even hits the stream channel, and then through underground movement moves into the stream itself. And so this is just an image of restoration work by the county in the 70s, and you can see how sandy the soil is. And so there's a lot of movement that happens in that groundwater area. And I think one of the exciting pieces of this project is I think there's a lot of opportunity to restore some of the ecosystems along the creek and within the watershed. You can see today that we have a lot of fragmented patches of ecosystems. So are there opportunities to expand them? Are there opportunities to connect them? Are there opportunities to improve their kind of physiological structure to make them perform better? These are all, I think, options on the table. So you can see the different types. We have a really interesting ecosystem gradient going from very fresh water in the headlands or headwaters down to saltier brackish water in Bayou Texar, ultimately entering the bay. And so we see different wetland types of freshwater marshes and saltwater marshes occurring along that gradient. And we also see some really interesting upland forest areas adjacent to forested wetlands along the creek. There are some really great places, and Lee will show some of these images of almost like forgotten forest buffers along the creek in the upper watershed that are quite beautiful. We did some kind of adventurous hiking to find the creek in some of these spaces this week. And there really are some like quite beautiful large trees and really interesting ecosystems. They're just not all very accessible to people, and so they're difficult to find, and I think most people probably don't know about them, though I assume many of you know and love the creek probably way more than we do. And so these remnant patches, I think, are very, very important ecosystems that need to be acknowledged and also improved upon. And so while this is an image from the 70s, the construction of a grocery store next to Carpenter Creek, we have many moments like this today where there are large commercial land uses very close to the forested fringes and the creek itself. So how can we either improve some of these conditions and introduce people into them to show the kind of beauty of the watershed itself? And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lee to kind of show some photographs and some sections of those different areas of the creek. So you don't have to climb down there today, you can kind of use our photographs. Thanks. Thank you. So let's see. Just for a sense of scale, the overall watershed, Carpenter Creek and Bayou Texar combined, comes up to just under 20 square miles. So for reference, that's about half the size of the city of Pensacola, or for the kids in the audience and the young at heart, it's about half the size of Disney World. So we're talking about a significant area of land that we're looking at here that all kind of drains and impacts these bodies of water. We know that today the water quality in both the creek and the bayou is impaired. This is based on Florida DEP definitions. We also know that the stormwater infrastructure, as well as the sewer, are aging and vulnerable to storms, and just kind of, the condition of the infrastructure is deteriorating progressively. There is legacy contamination for some of that historic industry, especially heavy metals and pesticides in the bayou sediments. The majority of the watershed, as we saw in the land use map that Gina was talking about, is built up, it's urbanized, so it's either residential, commercial, industrial, but most of it is built up. There's not a lot of open space remaining,
what little pieces remain are these fragments of the ecosystem that we still see today. There's a lot of erosion that we've seen along some of the stream banks, as well as areas where they've been hardened with gray infrastructure. And there are very few public kind of visible access points that we are aware of. Of course, if there are some that we haven't seen or are not aware of, we would love for you to let us know. One thing I wanted to note actually is that little handout that you picked up as you were walking in with information about the project. The back side of it has a little bit of a glossary of terms. So when we talk about permeability or non-point source pollution, if these are terms that you're not familiar with, they should be on the back of that little sheet. So we do have a lot of exciting opportunities though within this watershed and kind of along the creek and bayou, beginning with the fact that the waters are public and should be accessible and should be available for people to enjoy and use for recreation, for kind of nature-related activities. There is a really rich and fascinating cultural history that we're just starting to get to know, and you all probably know a lot more about. There's a very diverse local ecology and many remaining assets that we can build on and kind of leverage for that restoration process. And of course, there is some funding available. It is worth kind of clarifying that the project that we're pursuing right now is in fact a watershed management plan. But we will be recommending future projects for future capital projects that the county can, or a city could implement. So we were fortunate to be able to spend some time in the watershed yesterday and today. We didn't actually walk the whole thing, we drove most of it. But what we wanted to show you are a few examples of typical conditions that we've seen that you probably know, and think a little bit about how they impact the ecology, the habitat, water quality, etc. So what we're seeing here is a plan of the watershed with locations of these section drawings that I'm going to go through that basically slice through the landscape and show us what is upstream and kind of everything that is leading between the edge of the watershed and the water itself. So we started in Bayview Park, so it's all the way at the bottom, and where we're seeing probably the most publicly accessible point along the bayou with some open planted areas, some parking areas, which we've seen throughout, and just thinking about the process that rainwater, for example, goes through when it falls down in the residential area or in the planted area and infiltrates versus where it falls in a parking lot and then flows on the surface, picking up certain contaminants and then bringing them into the waters of the bayou. So this is what it looks like now, very accessible, very inviting, but one of the only points like that. A little bit further up, we have a kind of more suburban pattern of residential development of homes that face the bayou. One interesting condition that we've seen here is there are some roads that dead end at the bayou. Those are technically owned by the city or the county, so there's an opportunity there for public access. They also happen to coincide with stormwater infrastructure, so stormwater pipes that discharge directly into the Bayour Creek. So that's an example of one of those locations where people have private access, but there could be public access adjacent to it. A little bit further up, a similar landscape of post-war suburbs. We're starting to see a slightly steeper slope. As we go up, it gets steeper and steeper. So this is where we did some of that little adventurous hiking and climbed down a steep slope where we see some erosion along the creek beds, and that's what the creek looks like yesterday. Further up, there are areas where the creek bed has been widened over time, but adjacent to, again, we see some of the steep slopes, and these are adjacent to some of the big box businesses like the Target and the movie theater. Many of them have a large parking lot that's right up against that slope where all that runoff, again, drains into the creek. So that's one example where we've seen a really kind of healthy and robust tree canopy with a good range of trees of different ages and different species, but that all kind of gets cut off at the edge of the parking lot. Another condition is adjacent to some of the bigger infrastructure like 110 and I-10, we have some detention basins that were designed to detain and store and infiltrate some of the stormwater that runs off of these highways. So that's one example where if you didn't know, this just looks like a giant lawn, but if you look at the topography, you see this is actually a detention basin that's designed to hold some of the water and keep it in place as it slowly infiltrates. And the creek is actually behind that row of trees in the background. And then further up we go, this is closer to the headwaters of the creek where we really found this kind of seemingly pristine, but really very beautiful area that's, we've seen some evidence of beaver activity and a hidden gem that, that really should be accessible to the public. And then finally, just making the point that, you see that little letter G at the top right corner. This is a detention basin that is not adjacent to the creek or the bayou, but as we discussed, is part of the watershed. So water that's infiltrating there is still making its way through the water table into the creek or eventually into the bayou. So what we've seen earlier today is that detention basin where the county is using the opportunity to grow some floating wetland plants that would be used in creek bank restoration projects later on. So today's workshop, why we're all here having this conversation with you, just recapping some of the points that Chrissy made earlier. We talked a little bit about the watershed management plan, but really our primary goal is to have a conversation rather than a lecture, and listen to your stories, your histories, your knowledge, and anything that you would be willing to share with us. And we have a few ways of doing that. So if you do nothing else, if you're just, you've heard enough, you're tired, you want to go home, we have this little questionnaire, just a feedback or information sheet that you can fill in real quick. We have some specific questions about what you've seen or what you've experienced today or in the past. Fill those out, leave them behind. We will gather and read them carefully. We have a model, a 3D model that you may have seen when you were walking in. So the way that we're using this model is we have a series of these little flag pins with words like safe or accessible or unwelcoming or boring or special. And the idea is that you pick one of those flags and stick it in the model at a point where you think is described by one of these flags. So we've seen some fun or welcoming flags around Bayview Park, for example. We've seen some unwelcoming or polluted flags around some of the bridges. So we invite you to participate in that activity. We also have a series of maps that you've probably seen. There are Sharpies and Post-its scattered around the maps. Please don't feel intimidated to just pick a pen and start drawing or writing on top of those maps. This is really our best way to understand information in a spatial way and understand where it is and where certain activities or certain opportunities exist. So we have two types of maps. This is more of a line drawing with some of the street names and parks marked on it. And we have an aerial and high-resolution aerial photograph if it's easier to find things this way. So please take advantage of those. The little postcards that you may have picked up when you walked in, those have questions on the back. So the idea is you take a postcard, you write a little note on the back, and you mail it back to us. If you want to keep the postcards, that's okay. Take a picture, send us the picture instead. Or email us the picture, I mean. And finally, and most importantly, Travis mentioned our watershed story booth. So you may have seen our videographer, Liam, setting up as you were walking in. We have a little area with a green screen where we would really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you one-on-one, ask you a few guiding questions, and hear from you your watershed stories. So those will be captured. They will be immensely helpful for us as we are building our knowledge and our understanding of the watershed and of the community. We're also hoping to use those as part of our communications and social media process. As you've seen, it's a very long process, so one of the ways that we want to stay involved and keep you all engaged is share those stories with you and with the general public. I believe that's it.
We also want to mention that the Marine Science Academy.
Yes.
Oh, no.
All right, well, we have a couple of displays also out in the atrium area by the Marine Science Academy that are...
Yes, so the high school has a Marine Science Academy, and they have a couple displays out there, and I believe at Bayour's here with potentially some of the students that can talk to you about their program. Oh. So stop by and talk to them as well, and talk about the amazing things that they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. So one last thing is, if you're out of time, if you have to go, but you want to stay in touch, go visit the website, restorethewatershed.com. Email us, team@restorethewatershed.com. We would love to stay in touch. Thank you.